Who's excited to get into the Word this morning? It's great to be here with all of you. Like Pastor Jim said, they aren't here today. We'd love giving them some time off. Everything's going well here, Pastor Jim. I know you're watching, even though you're not supposed to. I know you're there. Because he's not here, we have a very, very, very special guest coming up in just a moment here. Like Pastor Jim was saying, we love for everybody to get on our communication. If you haven't done that, we've got links to get you on our newsletter and everything. What we noticed this week is that some change that Google made, a lot of our messages are going to people's junk mail. So if you realize you haven't gotten anything from Real Life in a little while, whether that's through Planning Center or our MailChimp emails, any of the regular stuff you would usually get, if you're not getting that, check your junk mail. Make sure you've got a set to go to your regular inbox. Just a quick little thing for you this morning. Also, if you're joining us for the first time today, I just want to give you a heads up. At the end of the service, one of our favorite things that we do as a church, we end our services with a time of connect questions. That's what we call them. We take 5 minutes at the end just to talk through a couple of questions. What did you hear today? What's a next step that you could take this week to walk out some of the values that you might have been impressed by? And then how can we be praying for you? So just so you know, we're going to end our service that way. So maybe you'll be listening for some things to share and talk about with the people around you at the end. But without further ado, I want to invite up my very, very good friend, Pastor Bruce. Can we make some noise for Pastor Bruce Kallies? You're all good. Are you unmuted and everything? We're good.
Okay. Okay. Nice to see you. Sitting in our row is my youngest son, Nick. He's on staff at River Valley Church, and the last 2 weeks, he was in Peru on the Amazon River, the headwaters, building a church for a congregation that needed a brand new church, and then filming it. He's on the video team. So I look forward to seeing that at some point. And as we were worshiping this morning, I had this visual in my mind of my first memory when I was very, very young. I believe I was not exactly a toddler, but a little older than a toddler. And I felt like I should share this with you, although it's not a good memory, a great memory. I was, my mom and dad were having a picnic at a trout stream, and I was up on a hill, and everything was beautiful and yellow, and a lot of just real pretty stalks of whatever. And I was coming down the hill when my dad said, this is my earliest memory in life. My dad said, "Be careful, come this way." And I was coming down this steep hill and come this way, further. And he ran me right over a snake that was coiled up in the sunshine. And I remember my mother was pretty ticked at him. And I thought, I don't know why God wanted me to share that, except maybe you have a father. My father would often be intoxicated, drunk. And maybe that's what was going on that day. I don't know. maybe you have a father who was much worse than that. And I felt like I'm telling somebody that God wants to be your father, and he is going to be a wonderful father. So don't shy away from taking him as your father. Well, I want to talk about the woman who loved Jesus most. And somebody said, "What are you talking about today?" And I said, "Prostitutes." And they laughed, probably thought I was kidding. But I would like to look at Luke, the 7th chapter, and I believe we're going to have it up on the board, beginning with verse number 36. Let me read that to you. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. The occasion here that we're talking about is a dinner party at the home of a well-to-do Pharisee. And most likely this house was in rectangular or square fashion, built around a courtyard, and it was in the courtyard where this dinner party would have taken place. Honored guests would have reclined on their left side. I was going to show you, but then I couldn't probably get up real fast. So picture me laying down on my left side, kind of holding myself like this. My right hand is free to eat, and my feet are barefoot because the sandals have been removed. Such dinners were often open to the public, and they were allowed to sit on the perimeter of the courtyard. Verse 37, our next verse. We're beginning our series, Close to Jesus, okay? So that'll give you a hint of where we're going. A woman in the town, verse 37, who lived a sinful life, learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. So a local resident showed up, not a person not specifically invited, but described as a woman who had a sinful life. You know what that was? That was a softer way of saying she was a prostitute. She made her living selling her body to men. I'm going to ask a strange question. Did you ever have an encounter with a prostitute? Because I did have an encounter with a prostitute, or 5 or 6 or 7 of them. I was the youth pastor in Cleveland, Ohio. It was 1975, 1975, 76, and 77. And Sherry's mom and dad were coming down to visit us. They lived in Detroit, and we lived in Cleveland, which they call the armpit of America. But it was a beautiful town. I love armpits. So, and that was, if Pastor is listening, that was not my best joke today. We decided to take Sherry's mom and dad to a great German restaurant in near downtown Cleveland. And I had directions. This was before the days of GPS. And I don't know what that stands for, but thank God for it. And I couldn't find the restaurant. And so everybody said, let's just go to a different restaurant, one that we drive by. But I was determined. And so that's when I saw a lineup of women standing against a building, 5 or 6 or 7 of them. Now, a sharper person would have caught on a little faster than I did what was going on. That was my best joke of the day. But I pulled over and saw the lineup of women, and I shouted out, "Do you know where the Hofbrau house is?" Not a soul moved. And I figured they could see in the back seat my wife sitting behind me, and next to her was my mother-in-law. And so obviously they were not going to make a penny on this deal, in this car. And so eventually so what I did when nobody moved, I yelled louder. I mean, isn't that what we do? That's what I always do. And eventually one very kind individual moseyed on over to the car and bent way, way down, looked into my father-in-law's eyes, batted her eyelashes, and said, "Baby, what is it that you were looking for?" And at that moment, from the back seat, I felt a laser death ray shining in the back of my head, probably from 2 people. And I know today the Pentagon is trying to develop this laser ray to shoot down airplanes. My wife and my mother-in-law developed that back in the 70s. They just never patented it. I think if it would be written out directions, the directions would be: find a knucklehead, stare at the back of his head until his hair goes and catches on fire. And so believe me, I said, okay. She gave me directions, and we never found the Hofbrau house. Her directions stunk, and she had a crazy story to tell, and I had a crazy story to tell too. But back to the Bible. My guess is that this woman heard about Jesus, this wonderful teacher. Everything she heard about him was great. And she was, have you ever heard the term hell-bent on getting there and seeing him? Maybe we should say she was heaven-bent on getting there and seeing him. Simon was hosting Jesus at his home, and she was determined to meet with Jesus, period. There was no stopping this woman. She was going to turn into a crazed woman to see Jesus. Now think about that. It was an invitation for men to come and meet with Jesus, not women. So somebody in that household, Simon's household, must have known her. And somebody in Simon's household let her into that meeting. And certainly there were people there, and probably the host, when this woman of the street walks into this church service at one of the Pharisees, the well-respected Pharisees' house. There must have been people who thought just her showing up was as bad as it was going to get. And they didn't want her to be there. She was maybe an embarrassment. But there is one phrase that comes to my mind. They ain't seen nothing yet, baby. For what she was about to do was nothing short of astonishing, the likes of which none of them had ever seen before. And in verse number 38, we now read, as she stood behind him, Jesus, at his feet. Remember, he's reclining, facing inward. His feet are down here, they're bare. As she stood behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair and kissed them and poured perfume on them. Can anybody say awkward? I cannot even imagine being in a situation even remotely that awkward. Put yourself in Jesus's position. That's one of the things I try to do through this. So I was going to share another very awkward situation, but for time's sake, I'm not going to. She came up behind Jesus, near his feet. We really don't know what her original plan was, but she arrived at the house, found Jesus, and when she found him, she just burst into tears. The kind of tears that shot straight out. The kind of tears that flooded a person's cheek and rolled down off his chin. She almost became a fountain of tears that soaked Jesus' feet. And with the cries that she was making came sounds of sobbing until everyone else in that meeting was struck silent at the spectacle. Once again, can anybody say awkward? And then, without thinking, she fell to her knees and did something indescribable. It was at that time and that place so culturally inappropriate that we can't even imagine today. She reached up and unfastened her hair, and her long flowing hair came down. And she used it as a towel to dry Jesus' feet. And if there was silence before on the part of the guests, now there were gasps. Because women only unfastened their hair to be seen at home by their husbands. Only young girls ever wore their hair or long or were seen in public. And for a grown woman to do that was considered a very provocative sign of immorality. And then she reached for the alabaster box, the container filled with perfume. Alabaster, if you don't know what it is, it's a soft stone that could easily be carved. And in fact, women would typically wear them on strings, maybe of leather, around their neck, and they were considered to be like jewelry. But they were also often of significant economic value. She had saved from her profession to buy expensive perfume. And that became, for not only for her, but many people in that day and age, sort of a rainy day fund. It was a very costly, and it was to be worn very close to a person to be safe. And if all economic resources ran out, at least a person could sell the perfume and have enough money to eat. But for sure, it was never something that was wasted. Never, never wasted. Now, you know what this woman is doing? What I'm describing, you're all familiar with. This woman was worshiping, extravagantly worshiping Jesus. This woman was all in, 100%. In fact, she didn't care what anybody else in the room thought. To her, it was as if just Jesus and her were in that room. We just worshiped Jesus a little while ago. Were you all in? I mean, all in? Did you not care what anybody in the room thought? Because if that's the case, then bingo, you deserve a gold star from God the Father today. Because the Father loves it when we worship His Son with all our heart, all our mind, and all our soul. Verse number 39 says, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, did you catch that? He said to himself, this man is a prophet. If this man was a prophet, he would know who was touching him and what kind of a woman she is. She is a sinner. Oh boy. Toward the end, I want to just talk for a moment about how comfortable Jesus was around sinners. So the host here, it's going to give his name in a moment. Until now, he hasn't been named. But the Pharisee who hosted all of this becomes harshly critical. Okay? Not so much of the woman with all her unusual behavior. He becomes critical of Jesus because Jesus tolerated this woman. Now, at least he was careful enough not to say his criticism out loud. Have you ever done that? Thought you got away with it? Well, he didn't get away with it. He simply thought to himself, if this man was a prophet, he would have known who was touching him, what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. And so he discredited Jesus. He allowed her to touch him And at least in this man's mind, Simon's mind, he was not considered to be a prophet, and he wasn't even qualified, definitely, to be a Messiah. So, Simon must have thought of himself as a rather good man. Obviously, he thought of himself as better than Jesus, and certainly a lot better than this woman who came into his house uninvited. Verse number 40 says, Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Uh-oh. Tell me, teacher, he said. But did you catch that? Jesus answered him. Did you catch that? Except Simon hadn't said anything. He only thought it. Jesus knew what he was thinking without him even speaking. He answered Simon by telling him a story, which is a parable. And here's the parable. In verse number 41, 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One of them 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now, Simon, which one of them will love him more? You don't even have to be a rocket scientist to get this one, you know. So borrower number 1, 50 denarii. That was about, it's a coin, it's about 2 months worth of wages, 50 denarii. A lot of money back then. A lot of money today. 2 months worth of wages. And in those days, you know what they would do if you couldn't pay? You were put into debtor's prison. And so our Constitution in America forbids that. Did you know that in 2023, I can tell where my head is, 19. In 2023, there were 53,000 bankruptcies in the United States. That's our alternative to putting people in jail for debt. In those days, they would put them in jail, and guess what? That would not lessen the debt. The debt would keep increasing. The interest would. And in fact, what it did really, it gave people's family the opportunity to show up and bail the person out, to rescue him. But borrower number 2 owed 500 denarii. That's about 20 months worth of income. That's a year and a half's wages. Think if you owed somebody a year and a half's wages. Maybe the first guy with 50 had a chance, an outside chance, but this guy had no chance at all to pay the money back. And in the story that Jesus tells, you know who the hero was? The moneylender. That's another little curveball here. The moneylender cancels the debt. And so Jesus asks Simon, which of the debtors would love the lender more? And like I said, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. Simon replied in verse number 43, I suppose the one with the bigger debt that was forgiven. And Jesus said, you have judged correctly, Jesus said. Now, verse number 44. Tighten your shoestrings on this one if your name is Simon. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon and to every other Pharisee who was there and critical of Jesus at this point. Did you see this woman? Do you see this woman? I came into your house and you did not give me water for my feet. But she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. Verse 45, you did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time that she entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. That's another big awkward. Verse 46, you did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Verse 47, therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little, implying, and that's you, Simon. Verse 48, then Jesus said to him, your sins are forgiven. Wow. Simon, as I said, was quite pleased with himself. He didn't think that he needed to be forgiven of anything. By contrast, this woman, who was keenly aware of her sinfulness and who was forgiven by Jesus, this woman was just overwhelmed with love for Jesus, gratitude for Jesus. I said the woman was worshiping Jesus. She got as close to him as she possibly could. And that's our series title going into Easter, Close to Jesus. She gave him everything she could. She lost control. It didn't make any difference what anyone else thought. All because her great sins had been forgiven. And it was as if they were the only two people in the room. She worshiped Jesus with all her heart, all her mind, and all her soul. Verse number 49 says, the other guests began to say among themselves, who is this who even forgives sin? Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. All the other guests were stunned by this, but they did ask the right question. Who is this that even forgives sins? And the answer is, only God. Only God can forgive sins. And her sins had been forgiven. So this Jesus must be what? God. And worthy of all of her best worship. Now, that's her story, and we don't even know her name. We know Simon's name, and we wished we didn't. But we don't even really know her name. But then when we read it, it comes into our story and what Jesus means to us, doesn't it? That we give to Jesus. And it's really about how we feel about Jesus. If we love him that much, we will want to give him the most precious possession that we have. And what is that? That's our heart. If we think this highly of Jesus, we want to give him our heart also. Among the legendary stories about Abraham Lincoln relates to his visit to a slave auction. Not to participate, but to observe. And what he observed was the unspeakable indignities of selling and the buying of human beings. And when he watched, he was touched with a mixture of emotions: disgust, sadness, and flat out outrage. While he was observing, a woman was brought to the block. She stood there to be auctioned off. And everything about her language, the expression on her face, the look in her eyes, screamed defiance and hatred. The story was that she had been abused by a previous owner, and she anticipated that this would be yet another awful chapter of the same thing in her life. The bidding began, and to everyone's amazement, Abraham Lincoln shouted out a bid, which was quickly exceeded. And so he bid again, and the price rose for her. He kept bidding and bidding until eventually he was declared the buyer. And so he went and paid the price and walked over to where she was being held. And he said to her, "You are free." And with it, animosity and hatred in her voice, she said, "Yeah, free for what?" And he said, "You're just free. Free to do anything you want to do. Free to go anywhere you want to go." And then her appearance began to change as she started to absorb what this stranger had just said to her. And then he said it again. "You're free. Free to go anywhere you want to go." And she said, as it's recorded, "Then I'm going with you." Excuse me, he probably didn't say it. She probably didn't say it like that. "Then I'm going with you." Now, some will say that's an apocryphal thing, never happened in Abraham Lincoln's life. Many historians say, no, it absolutely happened. Whether it did or didn't, I don't know. But it certainly explains something to me. All the people who followed Jesus, all the sinners, the tax collectors, Zacchaeus, Matthew, who followed him all of his life, the woman at the well, Mary Magdalene, who followed him to the very end. This woman who encountered Jesus at Simon's house, the woman taken in adultery, so many of them followed Jesus forever. Why? Well, Why wouldn't you follow a man like him? Was Simon the Pharisee, was he the hero of the story? No. Who was the prostitute, was the heroine of the story? Jesus said, my kingdom is going to be like an upside down kingdom. The super religious people are not going to get it. But the irreligious or the unreligious people will embrace it immediately. Do you see that in this story that I shared today? This woman was a worshiper because she had been forgiven much. This woman sought out Jesus. This woman spent her time and her very precious money to worship him. This woman gave gifts to Jesus, perfume, love through her tears, her heart, the most precious thing that she had, all just to get close to Jesus. And guess what? We can get close to Jesus anytime we want. Not just on a Sunday morning in a worship service. When was the last time you burst into tears like this woman? Just thanking Jesus for all the wonderful things he brought into your life. Well, let's bow our heads, close our eyes. I just want to ask today if there's anybody here who would say, I have never really committed my life to Jesus, but I am ready today. Would you lift your hand up and just make eye contact with me for a moment? Then I'll assume we're all believers. And for us, the message today is worship Jesus. Every chance you get with all your heart, all your mind, and all your soul. God bless you.